So you're an organic farmer. Congratulations. You're growing your crops organically within your backyard or any other area within your farm. Congratulations, because you're not using any chemical insecticide, chemical pesticides. You're not using any chemical manure to grow your crops in your backyard. You're not using any chemical herbicides to control weeds within your backyard. That's a good plus for you. That's okay. But then remember, unless you're living in a very large farm where you're isolated from your neighbors, there are those things which you cannot control in terms of organic gardening in your backyard. And one of the most important things that you cannot actually control is the farming practices of your neighbors. If your neighbors are not organic gardeners or organic farmers like you, that's not your problem per se, because you cannot control that. Everybody has their preference and choices. For instance, you can see in this backyard garden, there is that fence there, that chain link fence, which is separating the two gardens. This side, my backyard garden; that side, the neighbor's garden, in which he has planted maize and other things. I saw he had planted also some potatoes and some other vegetables. So if your neighbor decides that they are going to use herbicides, for example Roundup or glyphosate, which is used for killing weeds in their garden, you cannot control that, because that's their preference. If they prefer not to weed their gardens manually and use just a herbicide to kill off all the weeds and save them time, that's their preference. You cannot control that. For you, hope that your plants will still continue to grow organically, so that you get organic food in your diet. But then, whatever farming practice your neighbor adopts, that is their own preference, and therefore you cannot actually control that. If your neighbor decides to use pesticides on their farm to control insects and pests, you cannot control that. That is their preference. They may not want to have their crops damaged while they are watching by the insects and other pests which attack plants occasionally within their farm. And you cannot control which inorganic chemical they use in their backyard or in their farm while your crops are growing just in the neighborhood. Because of the fact that you prefer organic, yes, your neighbors may not prefer organic, some may prefer organic, but it's still okay, because that's their preference. Therefore, your control will be limited there. You can't control what they do. If your neighbor decides that they are going to use chemical fertilizers to boost plant growth in their garden, same way, you cannot control that. And occasionally, if your farm is located downstream from where your neighbor's farm is located, occasionally some of the chemicals in form of pesticides, herbicides and fertilizers they use in their garden may actually flow downstream to your garden, but you cannot control that, unfortunately. But you'll be lucky enough if your garden is the one which is located upstream from your neighbor's garden, and therefore their farming practices may not adversely affect your plants in case their use of herbicides and other pesticides and insecticides or chemical fertilizers are applied and they just flow downstream. For instance, here in this section of the backyard garden, this vegetable garden is located upstream to the area where the neighbor's garden is actually located, and therefore the application of fertilizers, specifically chemical fertilizers, in that neighbor's garden doesn't concern me in this side, because the soil level of the backyard garden here where I've planted vegetables is higher than the soil levels of the other side, which is a little bit lower. So if it's chemical fertilizers applied there, doesn't so much affect this way, because of the fact that downstream here it's a slope, and therefore the potential effects of the chemical fertilizers will not be so much felt upstream in this garden, because the usual thing or the usual phenomena is that once it rains, usually the rain will in most cases carry any residual chemical fertilizers downwards, because it's a slope there, and therefore the effects on the upstream gardens is actually limited to a great extent. The only thing which you may not survive if you are having a backyard garden close to your neighbor and he decides to use inorganic chemicals to maintain his garden, is if those inorganic chemicals are actually sprayed as a method of application in their garden. So if they are sprayed, then of course some aerosols from that spraying can move towards your garden and of course land on your plants, land on the soil within your garden, and that could potentially of course irritate you, since for you prefer organic gardening. But then you can't control that, because we're not the same. Every person has their own preference, and sometimes of course while they're spraying the insecticides and the pesticides within their farm, you may get the scent of those insecticides, but then you can't control that, because they're just being carried by air into your compound, and therefore that does not fall into your area of control. So they may of course affect your plants to some extent, but you still prefer to continue growing your crops in an organic manner, and therefore have organic food from your backyard garden there. Sometimes if they're using herbicides to control weeds in their garden, and the method of application of those herbicides is by spraying, of course again you can't control if the herbicides will actually find their way back to your garden, because that is not what you can easily control. Those herbicides will usually be carried by air if they have been applied by spraying and come to your side of the garden. But for you still, please, if you're an organic farmer, maintain organic farming to ensure that your plants and your food is organically grown for your own benefits, since for you have already established your preference as organically grown food and organically grown vegetables within your backyard. So those are some of the challenges, especially with regard to farming in an area which is not necessarily isolated from other backyard farmers. Once they apply inorganic chemicals in their farm, occasionally if it's by spraying, those will come to your side, but you should not bother yourself controlling them. That is their preference. So if you like the information presented in this video, consider subscribing to the channel. Actually hit the subscribe button. It's just down below in the just around the title of the video, around the bottom of the video there's a subscribe button there. Just hit it up to ensure that you continue getting more gardening tips. If you consider the information also useful, consider giving a like and also comment, so that I get to know which other areas of backyard gardening you may want me to cover in subsequent videos. And also share the video with your friends so that they also get additional tips concerning how to do backyard gardening within their own compound in an easy and efficient method. So thank you. We'll update you with more video to keep you updated on farming tips.